Revelation 2481. From the 21st, the 22nd and the 23rd of September 1942. Fall of the Angels. Substantial. Will and power. Free decision. Primordially, the beingness was full of light, it had emerged from God, it was perfect, that is powerful and mighty, because it was similar to God. It had the same will as God, that is its free will was turned towards God. It was equal to God. But because it was like God it also had to be able to create the same, thus essence emerged from it again. Beings came into being by virtue of the will of the being which had emerged completely from God, however, by using the strength flowing to this essence from God. And the fact that the being drew its strength from God was the reason for its rebellion against God, for the being thought itself so powerful that it believed it could create the same out of itself, and thus wanted to eliminate God as its source of strength. This was arrogance on the one hand and an abuse of will on the other, and both were directed against God. The fact that the being opposed God could only result in a weakening, but never in the withdrawal of the power it received. The being now considered itself capable of creating out of its own strength. And God let it create. What originally came forth from him could continue to use his strength at its own discretion. It was not deprived of strength, although the Creator's will turned against God. But now beings came into being with wills which had already turned against God. Beings were created which signified a countercurrent to God and therefore had to be regarded as children of Satan, thus as beings which were created by the will turned against God by using the strength from God. Thus the once perfect being fell away from God and was subordinate to a being that had once been the bearer of light and had now changed its light into darkness. For as soon as it separated from God, as soon as it opposed God, it was completely lightless. Thus it fell from the highest height into the deepest depth. It turned from a God-like being into a being completely alien to God, which distanced itself ever further from God and was now active as an opposing power. Countless beings emerged from this being, all of which were of a God-opposing nature. And thus the strength from God was misused, it was used to create something which was opposed to God, and this created being increased because the once perfect being's power was unlimited, thus it was able to create without diminishing the strength it received. But the created beings were now products of him who let his will become active, although the power from God only made the emergence of these products possible. Consequently, the same will was in the created beings as the producer carried within himself. The will of the beings was also God-opposing because the producer had placed it into the created beings, for the beings he created completely corresponded to his will and his image, thus they had, so to speak, involuntarily become what they were. So they had to be given freedom of will from God before they could be held accountable for their God-opposing attitude. And they now received the right of self-determination by virtue of which they could decide completely freely for their producer, out of whose will, or for the one out of whose strength they had emerged. This free decision only turned the being into a perfect being as soon as it turned to God. Yet the will of the producer was already too firmly rooted in it and thus the being decided in favor of him of its own free will, thus it was complicit in the rebellion against God, and now it belonged to the fallen angels who also had to atone for their open rebellion against God. And thus the will which God had given the beingness to decide freely was bound, so that the beingness now turns to God in a certain state of compulsion in order to then receive free will again in a higher stage in order to consciously decide for or against God. In the last embodiment on earth this free decision for or against God is demanded of the being, because in this last embodiment as a human being it is equipped with all gifts which enable a free decision. It is now presented with knowledge about God as well as his adversary, so that it can turn to anyone without any constraint, depending on its will. God does not demand anything impossible from people, he only demands their will, which should turn to him completely. But he has to demand this will because the being was once created out of a will which was opposed to God, and because the strength from God was used for this purpose. If the will is now turned towards God, then the being is a divine creature and can dwell close to God forever. But as long as the will still resists God, the being is the product of God's opponent, for the will determines the degree of divinity or remoteness from God. Their will is the actual essence, and therefore the will must strive towards God in order to let the essence become a God being. Thus the will must turn to God in earthly life as a human being. The human being must recognize the origin of the strength which created him in God and strive towards this original source of strength. Then the being has freely decided in favor of God and brought itself into a state which aligns itself with the essence of the eternal deity, and thereby also brings about an approach to God which is unspeakably blissful for the being. It has consciously decided for God, and this free decision makes it his creature, his child, which is placed into all the rights of a child. The spiritual being, which once fell away from God, has found its way back to the Father, from whom it can no longer separate, and thus remains united with him for all eternity. Amen.